Has the Lord spoken only through Moses? Hasn't he also spoken through us? The words come from Miriam first. Aaron stands beside her, but in the Hebrew text, it is her voice that leads the sentence. Two of the three most powerful people in Israel questioning the third, their own younger brother, out loud, where others could hear. God hears it too. Within moments, the cloud that marks his presence lifts off the tent and moves away. Aaron turns to look at his sister. And Miriam, prophet, tambourine player, the woman who once led every woman in Israel in a song of victory, is standing there, leprous, white as snow. Aaron did not turn white. Aaron is not struck, only Miriam. The Bible doesn't explain the imbalance, it simply records it. A prophet punished publicly for words her brother spoke with her, confined outside the camp for 7 days while an entire nation waits for her. And then she comes back in. The march continues, and she is never quoted again. This episode is not about proving Miriam guilty or innocent. It's about a question Scripture leaves open on purpose. What does it cost a person to be let back into the camp when the record never lets them speak again? If you've ever been forgiven out loud but never quite trusted the same way again, stay with this one. New episodes on people the Bible remembers but doesn't fully explain drop right here. Subscribe if that's the story you come back for. Before the 7 days outside the camp, we go back further to the girl who was watching the water long before anyone called her a prophet. There is a detail worth sitting with before anything else. The first time we meet the girl who would become Miriam, she is not named. She is simply his sister, standing at a distance, watching a basket of reeds drift on the surface of the Nile. Egypt has ordered every Hebrew baby boy killed. A mother has done the only thing left to do, hidden her son in a waterproofed basket and set him among the reeds, close enough to the riverbank that someone could still watch over him. That someone is a child, old enough to understand the danger, young enough that no one thinks to stop her from lingering by the water. When Pharaoh's daughter finds the basket and takes pity on the baby, the girl steps forward with a plan already formed. She offers to find a Hebrew woman to nurse him. She brings back his own mother and gets paid by Egyptian royalty to return her brother to her. It's a small, sharp piece of courage, a child outmaneuvering the machinery of an empire with nothing but quick thinking and nerve. Most scholars identify this unnamed sister as Miriam. If that identification holds, then her very first appearance in Scripture already tells us something about her. She watches carefully, she speaks at the right moment, and she is not afraid to step toward power and negotiate. There's an irony worth sitting with here, too. The child who saves Moses' life does it by appealing to an Egyptian princess, a member of the very household that ordered his death. Miriam's first recorded act isn't defiance of Pharaoh's system, it's fluency in it. She knows how to read a powerful woman's compassion in real time and use it. That instinct, reading a room, then moving decisively inside it, will resurface later in a much more dangerous room with far less compassion waiting for her. We don't hear from her again until decades later, after the 10 plagues, after Pharaoh's army drowns behind them in the sea. Moses leads Israel in a song, the Song of the Sea, one of the oldest pieces of poetry in the Bible. And then Exodus does something it rarely does for a woman. It gives her a title. Then Miriam, the prophet, Aaron's sister, took a timbrel in her hand, and all the women followed her with timbrels and dancing. She isn't called Moses' sister here. She isn't called Aaron's assistant. She is called a prophet, Nabiah, the feminine form of the same word used for Moses, for Samuel, for Elijah. It's easy to read past that word today. It would not have been easy to hear it then. In the ancient Near East, prophetic authority wasn't a title handed out casually. It meant a person was understood to carry a genuine word from God, to be trusted as someone through whom the divine spoke. Miriam is the first woman in the entire Bible to receive that designation. Not a wife of a prophet, not a mother of one, a prophet in her own right, leading her own liturgy, her own worship, her own line of women, singing back the same triumph Moses had just sung. That's the context that has to sit underneath everything that happens later. Miriam was not a bystander in Israel's story. She had a recognized voice, a recognized role, and, for at least one afternoon, on the shore of a sea that had just swallowed an army, the entire female half of the nation followed her lead. It would be centuries before another woman in Israel's history received a title carrying that same weight. Deborah, who would judge Israel and lead it into battle. Between Miriam and Deborah, the text offers almost no other woman described as speaking for God to the nation at large. Whatever Miriam had at the sea, it wasn't common, and it wasn't small. Later in the wilderness, when Israel's camp is finally organized by tribe, Numbers describes it in careful detail. 12 tribes arranged in a fixed square around the tabernacle, each with its position, its leader, its order of march. Miriam belonged to the tribe of Levi by birth, the same tribe entrusted with the sanctuary itself, close to the center of Israel's worship life, geographically and symbolically, even without an office of her own. But leadership built on a title like that carries its own quiet pressure. Moses spoke to God face to face, according to the text, in a way no one else did. Aaron was set apart as priest with garments, an altar, and a formal office that God himself designed down to the last thread. Miriam had the word prophet and very little else. No priesthood, no formally described office, no listed duties beyond that one moment at the sea, decades before the next time we hear her speak, which raises the question the rest of the timeline eventually answers. What happens to a woman who is given real spiritual authority, but never given a defined place to stand on it? The next time Scripture opens her mouth, the words are not song. They are challenge. And this time, they are aimed at her own brother, the one she once watched over in a basket of reeds. Numbers chapter 12 opens with a marriage. Moses has married a Cushite woman. Cush in the Hebrew Bible generally refers to the region south of Egypt, roughly modern Sudan and Nubia, meaning this wife was likely a woman of African origin, distinct culturally and ethnically from the Israelites and from Moses' earlier Midianite wife, Zipporah. Some later Jewish tradition tried to soften the tension by arguing Cushite and Midianite described the same woman, Zipporah, under two different regional names. The text itself never makes that identification. Read plainly. Numbers 12 describes a second marriage and an outsider entering the family at the highest level, which may be part of what unsettled Miriam and Aaron in the first place. Miriam and Aaron object, but the very next sentence in the text reveals that the marriage was only the surface issue. Has the Lord spoken only through Moses? Hasn't he also spoken through us? That's the real complaint, not who Moses married. Who Moses is. In the Hebrew, the verb that opens the chapter, "and she spoke," referring to both Miriam and Aaron together, is grammatically feminine singular. Most scholars who work closely with the text read this as a signal that Miriam is named first and speaks first because she is the one driving the confrontation. Aaron, the high priest, follows his younger sister's lead into a challenge against their youngest brother's unique authority. It isn't a small claim. By this point in the story, Moses has led Israel out of Egypt, received the law at Sinai, and organized the entire nation into tribes, camps, and worship. Miriam and Aaron aren't asking for a theological clarification. They're asking why one sibling gets to hold a kind of authority the other two don't, when, by their own account, God has spoken through all three of them. God's answer is immediate and total. He summons all three, not privately, but to the tent of meeting itself, the same structure where the cloud of his presence regularly rested, in full view of a camp that would have noticed three of its most recognizable leaders being called out at once. He speaks directly, drawing a line that leaves no room for negotiation. With other prophets, God speaks in visions and dreams. With Moses, he speaks mouth to mouth, clearly, not in riddles. Moses, the text says, sees the very form of the Lord. Then comes the question that closes the confrontation. Why then were you not afraid to speak against my servant Moses? It is not phrased as a question anyone was meant to answer. The cloud lifts off the tent, and Aaron, turning toward his sister to see what has happened, sees her leprous, skin diseased, white as snow. Only Miriam is struck. The text never claims Aaron was punished the same way, and the ancient rabbis noticed the imbalance long before modern readers did. Some suggested Aaron was spared because striking the high priest with a skin disease would have disqualified him from ever serving at the altar again, which would have unraveled Israel's entire sacrificial system. That's a plausible historical explanation for why the consequence fell unevenly. But it is a proposed reason, not a stated one. The text itself offers no justification for the difference. It simply shows us one sibling untouched and the other transformed in an instant in front of everyone. Aaron's response is immediate panic, not defense. He turns to Moses, not to God, and calls him my Lord, a title from a man who is technically his younger brother and formerly his nation's high priest. He begs him not to hold the sin against them, comparing his sister's condition to something already half consumed in the womb, dead before it drew breath. It's a plea from a man watching his sister transform in front of him and finding no words strong enough except borrowed ones. My Lord, don't let this be permanent. Moses, in turn, doesn't argue with God's judgment. He simply cries out 5 words in Hebrew, among the shortest prayers in the entire Bible. Elna, refanala. Heal her now, I beg you. God's response is not a full pardon, it's a negotiated sentence. If her own father had merely spit in her face, an act of public contempt described elsewhere in the law as the fitting response to a man who refuses his duty to his brother's widow. She would carry that shame for 7 days. So, 7 days, confined outside the camp. Not permanent, not without a path back in, but not instant either. Notice what the sentence does and doesn't do. It doesn't erase the punishment. 7 days stands, but it caps it, sets an end point, and describes a path back in. Whatever this moment was, the text frames it as discipline with a door on the other side, not permanent exile. The first price has been set, and it's about to become something far bigger than one woman's skin. To understand what those 7 days actually meant, it helps to understand what outside the camp meant in the world Miriam lived in. Under the law given at Sinai, anyone with a visible skin disease was required to live apart from the rest of the community, not simply asked to stay in a tent on the outskirts, but formally separated, their clothing torn, their head left bare, required to call out, unclean, unclean, if anyone approached. The regulations in Leviticus group skin disease with other conditions that made a person ritually unclean, certain bodily discharges, and contact with a corpse. All 3 categories were sent outside the boundary of the camp together. Whatever social standing Miriam had carried up to that point, sister of the leader, prophet in her own right, the woman whose voice had once started an entire nation singing, none of it exempted her from walking out past the tents to stand among the ritually unclean. There is also a detail in the law worth noticing for what it implies about that week specifically. Under this system, it was the priest's job to examine a person with a suspected skin disease and formally declare them clean or unclean. In this period, that priest was Aaron. Whether or not he performed the examination himself in Miriam's case, the structure of Israel's law placed the verdict on her condition and the authority to let her back inside the very family she'd stood beside days earlier. Her brother wasn't only the one who had pleaded for her. Under the law he now served, he may have been the one required to formally look at her and decide when the 7 days were satisfied. And the camp she was leaving was not small. By the census taken earlier in the book of Numbers, the fighting men alone numbered over 600,000, which means the total population, counting women, children, and the elderly, likely reached well over 1 million people, along with their flocks, tents, and supplies. By this point, the camp had also been given a fixed shape, 12 tribes arranged by careful order around the tabernacle at the center, each family unit in its designated place, a structure meant to move together as one body across the wilderness. This was not a village pausing for a week. It was closer to a small, tightly organized nation, camped in the wilderness, waiting. And wait they did. Verse 15 states it plainly. The people did not move on till Miriam was brought in again. Not Moses' decision, not a quiet accommodation worked out among leadership. The text records it as a fact about the whole community. Everyone's departure delayed because of what happened to one woman. It's worth pausing on the maths of that sentence. A nation in transit, needing to keep moving toward the land it had been promised, depended on manna, gathered daily, water found at each new stop, animals grazed at each new stop, and none of it moves for 7 full days until Miriam is let back in. There's no record of what she felt sitting outside those tents. The text doesn't give us her thoughts during the 7 days, only the fact of the confinement and the fact of the delay. But it isn't hard to imagine the weight of both facts sitting on the same person at once, marked as unclean, and simultaneously the reason an entire people cannot go anywhere. Whatever quiet dignity she might have wanted in that week, the delay made her impossible to overlook. Everyone in that camp knew exactly why they weren't moving. If you've ever been the reason things stopped, the one whose mistake everyone else had to wait out, work around, or accommodate, you already know that kind of visibility doesn't fade quickly, even after the waiting is over. There's a particular loneliness in being the delay itself, not just carrying your own consequence, but knowing every person around you is carrying it too, whether they say so or not. Sitting with that feeling for a moment. What does it do to a person to know that their failure became, however briefly, the whole community's shared inconvenience? Not whispered about from a distance, but felt directly, by name, by every family whose journey stalled on her account. There's no indication the rest of the camp resented her for the delay. No recorded complaint, no grumbling singled out against her the way Israel grumbles against Moses elsewhere in this same book. If there was resentment, the text chose not to preserve it. What it preserved instead was simpler and, in its own way, heavier. The plain fact that everyone waited, and everyone knew why, because the 7 days did end, and what came next in the text is not what most readers expect. Verse 15 finishes with 4 words that look like a resolution. Miriam was brought in again. The disease is gone. The exile is over. the camp packs up and moves on toward the wilderness of Paran. On the surface, this reads like restoration. Sin confessed, judgment served, mercy granted, story closed. But something closes in this verse that never reopens. From this point forward, in the entire rest of the Torah, Miriam never speaks another recorded word, and no one is ever recorded speaking to her again either. The woman who once led a title role in Exodus, prophet, worship leader, the one whose actions Scripture bothered to name, becomes from this chapter on a name that appears only in lists, in genealogies, and in one final report of her death. Her dialogue in the Bible ends here, in the same chapter where her punishment began. That alone would be a striking silence, and it's worth pausing on how sharp the contrast really is. This is the same woman who, as a child, stepped toward an Egyptian princess with a plan already formed. The same woman who, as an adult, picked up a timbrel first and led an entire nation of women in worship without waiting for permission from anyone. Boldness was not foreign to her. It was, if anything, her defining trait across every appearance before Numbers 12. After it, that trait simply stops showing up in the text, not gradually, not with a recorded moment of decision. It just isn't there anymore. But the investigation turns up something sharper still. Years later, in the book of Deuteronomy, Moses is delivering his final address to the generation about to enter the Promised Land. Nearly everyone who witnessed the wilderness of Paran firsthand has since died in the wandering. This is largely a new generation, hearing the old laws restated for the first time as instructions for a life none of their parents got to live. In the middle of instructions about skin disease, Moses says this: "Be careful in cases of leprous disease, to be very careful, to do according to all that the Levitical priests shall direct you. Remember what the Lord your God did to Miriam on the way as you came out of Egypt." He doesn't retell the confrontation. He doesn't mention the challenge to his authority or the marriage that sparked it or his own 5-word prayer on her behalf. All of that is left out. What survives, compressed into a single instructive clause, is her name attached to a punishment, offered as evidence for why the law about skin disease should be taken seriously. Her worst moment did not stay a private family memory. Moses, her own younger brother, the one whose authority she had once questioned, turned her punishment into instructional material, a case study cited by name, taught to a generation of Israelites who had likely never met her, as the example of what happens when this particular law is violated. It's not framed as cruelty. In context, it functions as a warning meant to protect the community, a way of saying, take this seriously, because I watched it happen to someone real. But the effect on Miriam's legacy is unavoidable. The single worst week of her recorded life became the law's go-to illustration, repeated to strangers for years, possibly generations, after she herself had gone silent. There is a particular kind of exposure in that. Most people who go through public failure at least get to imagine that time will eventually blur the details, that the story will fade into background noise. Miriam's story didn't fade, it became curriculum. Her brother, in the act of protecting future Israelites from disease, preserved his sister's most humiliating chapter as a teaching tool, on the record, for good. That's the turn this investigation was building toward. The 7 days outside the camp were not, in the end, the full cost. The full cost was that her silence and her shame outlived her, carried forward by someone she loved for a reason she likely would have agreed with in principle, protecting future generations from a real disease, in a way she almost certainly never wanted for herself. There is a difference between a punishment that ends and a punishment that becomes doctrine. Miriam's crossed that line the moment Moses wrote it into the law he handed to the next generation. It's worth being honest about what this doesn't prove. It doesn't prove Moses resented her or that the family relationship stayed broken. Citing a case in a legal address is not the same as holding a grudge. Moses was, by the text's own account, still grieving deeply when he eventually lost both siblings. What it does prove is narrower and, in its own way, more disorienting. That in the official record Israel carried forward, Miriam's name became inseparable from that one chapter, not her leadership at the sea, not her role in saving her brother's life as a child, the leprosy, and it's from there that the deepest question of this episode opens. What happened to her inside? Across the years, the text simply refuses to describe. Here is what the record actually gives us, laid out plainly before any reconstruction begins. We know Miriam was readmitted to the camp after 7 days. We know the nation continued its journey. We know that the leprosy incident happens relatively early in the wilderness period. Most timelines place it in the 2nd year after leaving Egypt. And we know that the next and final thing the Torah tells us about her is a single verse, near the very end of the 40 years. The people entered the desert of Zin, and Miriam died there and was buried there. That's Numbers chapter 20, verse 1. No age given, no cause given, no words from her recorded in between. Somewhere in the span of roughly 38 years, between one confrontation and one funeral notice, the text simply goes quiet on her. That is where the record ends. Everything past this point is reconstruction, and it has to be treated that way. What the context allows us to suppose is limited, but not nothing. We know the role of prophet she once held was not stripped from her by any formal decree. Scripture never revokes the title. We know women continued to play a role in Israel's worship life in later generations, with singing and dancing appearing again in celebrations recorded in the books of Judges and Samuel, which suggests the tradition she once led did not vanish with her. And we know that when Moses cites her by name in Deuteronomy as a cautionary example, he does so without a hint of ongoing resentment or distance. He speaks of what the Lord did to Miriam, not what Miriam did to him, which may suggest the personal relationship between the siblings survived the incident, even if her public voice did not. Two honest possibilities sit side by side here, and the text doesn't let us fully choose between them. One possibility: Miriam's silence in Scripture reflects a real and lasting silence in her life, that the humiliation of Numbers 12 cost her the public platform she once had, and she spent the remaining decades present in the camp, present in the family, but no longer leading, no longer quoted, effectively retired from the role she'd once defined for herself. The other possibility: Miriam kept speaking, kept singing, kept leading women in worship exactly as she had at the sea. And the text simply stopped recording it, the way it stops recording countless ordinary faithful years for nearly every figure in the wilderness narrative. Silence in the text is not always silence in the life. Most of Israel's 40 years go entirely undescribed for everyone, not only for Miriam. Of the two, the first feels more historically coherent, for one specific reason. Deuteronomy's use of her story as a warning example suggests her name had become permanently, publicly attached to that one chapter, which would have made a full return to public leadership difficult, whatever her private standing remained. It is one thing to be forgiven within a family. It is another to lead a nation that has been taught by law to remember you as the person leprosy happened to. If that reading holds, the emotional cost becomes clearer. Not banishment, not ongoing punishment, but something quieter and in some ways harder. Presence without platform. Reinstated but not restored to the role she'd built. Loved, likely. Trusted with a title, no longer. A woman who once stood at the front of the whole community's worship, now simply one more person walking through the wilderness among a million others. There is one more piece worth including here, not as evidence, but as a window into how deeply this silence unsettled the generations who came after her. Centuries later, Jewish tradition, not Scripture itself, but later rabbinic commentary, noticed something odd sitting directly next to her death notice. The verse announcing Miriam's death is immediately followed in the very next verse by Israel running out of water for the first time in the story. Rabbinic tradition connected the two, proposing that a miraculous well had traveled with Israel throughout the wilderness in Miriam's merit, and disappeared the moment she died. It's a beautiful idea, and it is tradition, not text. Nothing in Numbers itself claims a well existed or that it was tied to her. But it's telling that this is the story later generations felt compelled to invent. Faced with a woman the Torah let go silently. Without eulogy, without ceremony, the rabbis reached for an explanation that gave her death cosmic weight anyway, as if the community itself couldn't accept that someone so central could simply stop being spoken of. There is no false certainty available here, and this investigation won't manufacture one. What can be said honestly is this: Whatever the last decades of Miriam's life looked like up close, the text chose to end her speaking role at the exact moment her authority was challenged, and never gave it back to her on the page, even after giving her body back its health. The healing was recorded. The restoration of her voice was not. Centuries after her death, one final line about Miriam would surface, not from Moses, not from the wilderness narrative, but from a prophet who never met her. And it would say something the wilderness years never got the chance to. Most people never lived through anything as dramatic as leprosy in front of a nation. But almost everyone has lived through some version of Miriam's second half. The part after the mistake, after the apology, after the door technically opens back up. You said the wrong thing in a room full of people who mattered, and you were let back into the room, but not quite trusted with the microphone again. You were forgiven at home, on paper, in words, and still felt the small hesitation every time you spoke. The sense that people were watching to see if it would happen again. You did the 7 days, so to speak. You came back in, and somewhere along the way, you noticed that back in and fully restored were not actually the same thing. That gap is worth naming honestly, because it's rarely spoken about directly. Forgiveness can be real and immediate, and trust can still take years to rebuild, sometimes longer than the offense itself lasted. A parent can mean it completely when they say, "We're okay now," and still flinch just slightly. The next time you raise your voice about something, a team can genuinely welcome you back after a mistake and still route the important decisions around you for a while without ever saying so out loud. None of that makes the forgiveness fake. It just means healing and trust travel at different speeds. And most of us were never taught to expect the gap between them. Miriam's story doesn't pretend those two things are the same. God heals her body in a single verse. Her voice in the text never comes back at all. Both are true. Neither cancels the other. But the investigation doesn't end at Numbers, and neither does Miriam's story. Centuries later, the prophet Micah delivers a message to Israel, reminding the nation of everything God had done for them. And in the middle of that reminder, Micah says this, speaking as God, "I brought you up out of Egypt and redeemed you from the land of slavery. I sent Moses to lead you, also Aaron and Miriam." Read that list again. Moses, Aaron, Miriam, named together, sent together, credited together. One sentence, no asterisk, no mention of what happened in the wilderness of Paran. This is the last word Scripture has on Miriam, delivered generations after her death, through a prophet who had every reason to include the leprosy if it were meant to define her. He doesn't. He puts her exactly where Exodus first put her, alongside her brothers sent by God, part of the reason Israel was free at all. That's the reframe the story offers, and it isn't a tidy one. The community's memory of Miriam, shaped by Deuteronomy, held on to the warning. God's own final accounting, delivered through Micah, held on to the sending. Both are in the text. Only one of them gets the last word. If there's a place in your life where a chapter you're ashamed of has quietly become the whole book people remember you by, even people who love you, even people who forgave you, this is worth sitting with. Being unspoken by others is not the same as being unseen by the one who first sent you. The record can go silent on a person for 38 years and still not have the final say. It also cuts the other way, gently. If you're the one who's kept someone at arm's length long after the apology, long after the 7 days were technically served, Miriam's story is worth a second look from that angle too. The camp did let her back in, but the text never records anyone going out of their way to hand her the tambourine again. Sometimes restoration stalls not because forgiveness was withheld, but because nobody thought to offer the roll back, and the person who lost it didn't feel entitled to ask. The small, honest step from here isn't to force your way back onto a platform nobody's offering. It's simpler than that, and harder in its own way, letting a later word be allowed to matter as much as the one everyone remembers. Miriam didn't get to read Micah's sentence about herself. You might get the chance to actually believe yours before it's centuries away. Miriam walked back into that camp healed, and the record never argues that she wasn't. It just stops telling us what happened to her afterward, which, if you think about it, is true of most of us too. Nobody gets a narrator following them through the quiet decades. We just get to decide day by day whether the worst chapter gets to write all the rest of them, or whether we let a later word, even one that arrives centuries too late for Miriam to hear it herself, carry just as much weight. If this one landed somewhere real for you, tell us in the comments. Has there been a season where you felt let back in, but never quite trusted the same way again? By others or by yourself? We read every one. Whatever chapter you're standing in right now, it isn't the last word on you either. Somewhere down the road, a truer sentence is still waiting to be written about you than the one everyone's currently repeating. Thank you for spending this time with Miriam's story. God bless you.